and this is section 3.7 and 3.8 notes, starting with section 3.7, ecosystem change. Ecosystems have the ability to regrow after disasters, and the process of rebuilding an ecosystem is called ecological succession. So the formal definition of ecological succession is the continual replacement of one community by another that occurs after some disturbance in the ecosystem. And there are two types of succession. There's primary and then there's secondary. Primary succession is when there's a new soil formed or where it's not supported life before. So this could be created by like a lava flow or a retreating glacier. Then secondary succession happens after a devastating disaster of some sort, where the soil will remain, but the community that was living on that soil is destroyed. Like, for example, an abandoned farmland, where it was being used in supporting crops, but then they just stopped using it. And it needs to take time for that soil to rebuild itself and back to its natural state that it would have been before it was being farmed. So let's talk a little bit more about primary succession. It occurs when barren land begins to grow. So like after a glacier retreats, new land, new soil is revealed. And the growth starts with lichens. They help build up the soil by putting lots of nutrients into it. Lichens are considered a pioneer species, which means they're the first species to inhabit that new soil in the disturbed area. After the lichens have established themselves, then grasses come about, and then much later trees will grow. But this occurs over a long period of time, like hundreds of years it takes to get from this stage of new soil and just some lichen, mosses, and fireweeds. It takes a long time for a forest to establish itself, because first, you have some plants that are living here, or it could be some food for some other little organisms like bunnies or birds in other ecosystems that are close, and they come over to find the new food source, and then they have eaten seeds from other ecosystems, and then they lay their droppings in this new ecosystem, and then those seeds will finally take their ground and then grow. That's how these things start. So then secondary succession. So the soil stays with secondary succession. It happens after like disasters like a forest fire. But the soil is broken down so pioneer species can grow and help rebuild the soil. So the seeds that were dormant in the soil, they begin to grow, and then eventually grasses develop, and then again trees develop, and then it becomes a young forest again. But again, this takes a long time to get to that point where you start with small grasses and then eventually trees grow. And so when an ecosystem gets to that point where there's mature trees, that's called a climax community, the end result of ecological succession. And it's different depending on the biome. And if you remember what a biome is, biomes can be like a rainforest or the desert or a grassland, like a prairie. Or it could be a mature forest. Climax communities are subject to disasters like forest fires, and humans can do things about it to help maintain these climax communities so they don't get completely devastated. We can do controlled burns, which I'll talk about in a little bit, or we just go in and cut out all the dead materials, so the dead plant materials, so the new stuff can take over and grow and thrive. So why is succession so important? Well, it helps ecosystems survive through disasters. It helps them just become more vital. So it allows for new growth in barren land. And then sometimes disasters like fire are a good thing. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. It's hard to think about, why would fire be a good thing for an ecosystem? But it really is. It's just one of those natural things that comes about. And I'm going to talk to you about Touch the Skies Prairie. This will help us learn a little bit about controlled burning and rebuilding and rehabilitating natural ecosystems. So this Touch the Sky Prairie is in Rock County, Minnesota. It's only a few miles from my house. So if you know where Laverne is, it's a few miles northwest, back towards Brandon. And a it's a prairie that's being rebuilded on the national level. I'll tell you a little about it. It's being managed by the National Wildlife Refuge of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was heavily grazed for over a century, this land. It was previously pasture. But now it's being rehabilitated and restored into a healthy native prairie. So this is what it would have looked like before it was settled. This is the natural prairie, and it's really cool. It covers over 1,000 acres of federally owned land. So they have purchased land from farmers that no longer want it, or they give them a really good price for it, so they don't need it anymore. And then they rehabilitate it and put it back into prairie land. It's pretty cool. So once they purchase the cropland, they restore it by planting native grasses or wildflowers, excuse me. They try to imitate what species were present prior to settlement. And they often harvest native grass from wildflower seeds or from other native or already restored units. And then they plant those seeds on the new site. So it's totally natural. It's really cool. I got all of this information from their website. So if you want to know more about it, just talk to me and I'll give you the website. So Touch the Sky Prairie uses controlled burns. They call it prescribed fire. And fire is a natural, integral part of what historically formed and manages the prairie. Fires do really, really good things. They burn off the buildup of dead plants from previous growing seasons. They expose the soil to air. They aerate the soil, get that oxygen down into the soil. And then they recycle the nutrients. And we know from our last section that recycling nutrients into the soil is a very important thing to allow new plants to grow. So many native plants need intense heat to germinate. They've evolved over the years because fire is such a natural part of ecosystems that they've evolved to need heat to germinate. That's what sends the signal that, hey, okay, it's okay to germinate now. They need intense heat. And the National Wildlife Service generally burns these areas on a 3 to 5 year rotation. That's what they found works best to keep the ecosystem, the prairie, at its peak performance. All right, so section 3.8, pollution. Changing gears a little bit. So let's talk about air. What makes air so important? Air is made up of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and water vapor, and it supports living things on the planet. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to live without it. So it's really important that we keep it clean. So air pollution is chemical, physical, or biological agents that modify the natural characteristics of the atmosphere. You can do this, you can pollute the air by burning fossil fuels, like we talked about in the last section, with combustion. The use of herbicides and pesticides, they also can pollute the air. Landfills, they give off gas, methane gas, when there's all kinds of waste sitting on top of each other that just lets off gas that pollutes the air. And then the use of certain aerosols can also pollute the air. So, why is air pollution so bad? Well, it can cause lots of things. One is acid rain, where precipitation with a low pH, which means it's acidic, has adverse effects on forests, freshwater habitats, and soils. It just totally deteriorates them. As you can see from this picture here, this would be a healthy one, and this is one that's been devastated by acid rain. The rain is acidic, and the plants don't know how to use that. Air pollution can also cause an amplification of what's called the greenhouse effect. And I'm sure you've heard of it before, but the greenhouse effect is when the atmosphere is trapping heat that's radiated from the Earth's surface. So a little bit of greenhouse effect is totally normal. That's what keeps this Earth, this planet, at a good temperature for us to be able to live on it. But when there's air pollution, it increases, it amplifies the greenhouse effect, and then this earth becomes too hot. So you increase the carbon dioxide levels, and that allows the atmosphere to trap even more heat. And the temperature of the earth slowly rises, and this is what is called global warming. They've been talking about it a lot. It's more so called climate change now because we're not exactly sure what's happening with the earth and its fluctuations of its temperature, because science is an ever evolving thing and we're learning more and more every day. So another result of air pollution is ozone depletion. So the use of aerosols containing chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, they break down the ozone. So if you've heard of like a hole in the ozone layer, that's what does that. Chlorofluorocarbons break down the ozone. So here's a picture of the greenhouse effect so you guys understand it a little bit better. So the sun shines its rays on the earth, and that bounces back and then hits the atmosphere. So some sunlight that hits the earth is reflected, and that becomes heat. So when that reflects back and forth, that's what's actually heating the earth. And then CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere trap the heat, keeping the earth even warmer. So we need to be conscious of the amount of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere. So water. Water is also a vital part of life. So what makes water important? It supports all life on Earth. Clean drinking water is necessary for health, and clean water is important for water-dwelling organisms. We learned a lot about water from Mr. Erickson and his talk. It's pretty amazing what we don't know and what we don't think about what's happening with our just a regular drink of water. There's a lot of work that has gone into that. So we need to make sure we keep that water clean. Water pollution is, this is just nasty, this picture. Water that does not support human use or unable to support ecological communities. We need to be able to keep this water clean so we can not only support our own human life, or we need to be able to support the ecosystems that we live in. So there are a couple different types of pollution. There's non-point solution, and then there's point source solution. So non-point source solution is when contamination does not originate from a single point. It comes from like all over, like that would be considered runoff from farmland or stockyards, like manure being moved and then put into a water stream. And runoff from farmland, all the chemicals that farmers are putting on their crops these days, like pesticides to keep the bugs away and herbicides to keep the weeds down, and then they put on nitrogen to make sure that there's lots of nutrients in the soil for the plants, and they also put on manure, so that also helps fertilize the soil. But that, if there's too much rain and if they put too much on, an excess of it, then that gets washed out of the soil, and that becomes runoff, and then it will pollute our water streams. Then there's point source solution, and point source solution is just the opposite. Contaminants that enter water through a single point. We know exactly where the source is. Either it was a sewage leak or like an industrial waste or an oil spill. These are some examples of an oil spill. And this would be an example of runoff. See these cattle, and now all that manure is just coming out of the yard. And where's that going to go? It's probably going to go into a culvert in the ditch somewhere, and then eventually into a stream, and then into a river, and then into the water treatment plant. So, the effects of water pollution. Why should we care? Well, there's something called eutrophication, where there's an excess of nutrients, specifically compounds containing nitrogen and phosphorus. This causes plants to overgrow, and because they overgrow, that takes all the oxygen out of the water. And so fish aren't able to survive because there's no oxygen, because the plants have kind of suffocated them out. And this also, having water pollution causes a lot of harm to organisms in the water, because many of the animals that live in the water can absorb the toxins through their skin, and then eventually those toxins make their way through the food chain. So if a fish is absorbing this toxin and then a bird eats that fish that has those toxins, that bird's going to die. So what can be done? Well, we can use water recycling systems. We can use less water. Just be aware of where your wastewater is going, and be aware and conscious of how much water you're using. Using natural things like swamps and grasslands to filter the water. Just using nature. Things might take a little bit longer, but using nature is the best way to get things done. Then there's something called catchment management. It's a method used to recharge groundwater supplies. And we just learned what groundwater is. This water that's just in the soil. And that helps the formation of groundwater wells and reduce soil erosion. So managing that so it it allows the soil to stay intact and it doesn't erode. It's pretty awesome. That's the end of 3.7 and 3.8.